They say blood is thicker than water, but they never warn you that the deepest wounds are often inflicted by the hands you share that blood with. Trust, once shattered within a family, doesn't just break, it evaporates, leaving behind a ghost that haunts every memory, a faint whisper in every empty room where laughter used to live. For Ethan Miller, this truth was about to become the very foundation of his new world, a world built on the rubble of the old one. It was a Monday morning, crisp with the scent of early autumn, the kind of morning that usually promised the comforting aroma of freshly cut oak and pine. As his truck crunched over the gravel of the familiar driveway, Ethan felt the quiet satisfaction he always did when he saw the old hand-painted sign, Miller & Sons Fine Woods. It was more than a business. It was a legacy, carved into the heart of their family for 3 generations. He reached for his keys, a worn brass ring heavy with history, and walked toward the large workshop doors. He slid the key into the lock, the same motion he had made thousands of times since he was a boy, but this time, something was wrong. It didn't turn. It didn't even slide all the way in. A cold, metallic resistance met his push. Confused, he looked closer. The familiar, weathered brass lock plate was gone, replaced by a gleaming, stainless steel monstrosity, clinical and unwelcoming. And then he saw it. Tacked brutally to the ancient oak door was a sign, its stark white plastic and bold black letters of violent intrusion on the rustic wood. SOLD. Under new management, Apex Holdings. The words didn't compute at first. His mind reeled, searching for a logical explanation. A mistake, a prank, anything but the cold, hard finality staring back at him. His breath hitched, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his brother's number. Leo, the business mind, the smooth talker, the other half of Miller & Sons. It rang once, twice, then clicked directly to voicemail. You've reached Leo Miller. Leave a message. The cheerful, recorded voice was a grotesque parody in the face of Ethan's silent scream. He called again and again, each time the same result. The silence on the other end of the line wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an answer. It was a confession. And in that chilling silence, standing before the locked doors of his life's work, Ethan understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a betrayal. His legacy, his past, his future hadn't just been lost. It had been sold. And the man holding the money was his own brother. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the grain of the Miller family, for like the wood they shaped, their history was one of strength, character, and hidden fault lines. The story of Miller & Sons Fine Woods did not begin with Ethan and Leo. It began with their grandfather, Elias, a man who arrived in America with little more than calloused hands and a deep, instinctual understanding of timber. He built the first workshop with his own 2 hands, and within its walls, he didn't just build furniture, he built a reputation. A Miller piece was known to be honest, sturdy, and timeless. It was a legacy of substance over style, a quiet promise of quality that was passed down to his son, Arthur. Arthur Miller, the father of Ethan and Leo, was the bridge between the old world and the new. He inherited his father's skill, but also possessed a keen sense of the changing times. He expanded the business, but never at the expense of its soul. He was a man of quiet wisdom, often found running a hand over a plank of cherry wood, as if listening to its secrets. He raised his 2 sons in the sawdust and the scent of varnish, teaching them that trust was the master joint that held a family together. A flawed piece of wood can be strengthened, he used to say, his voice a low rumble against the hum of the band saw, but a broken promise leaves a crack that can never truly be filled. His sons, however, were carved from 2 entirely different trees. Ethan, the younger, was his grandfather's echo. He was a man who spoke through his hands. Words were often difficult for him, but in the workshop, he was a poet. He could read the story of a tree and its rings, could anticipate how a joint would fit with a precision that was more instinct than mathematics. For Ethan, the workshop was a sanctuary. The rhythmic scrape of a hand plane was his meditation, the whine of the lathe his music. He didn't see the business in terms of profit and loss, but in terms of projects and passion. His joy came from the transformation of a raw, unyielding material into something of beauty and function, something that would become a part of another family's story. He was grounded, steady, and deeply in love with his wife, Clara, a landscape architect who understood that some of the most beautiful things in life take time and patience to grow. She was his anchor, a woman who could read the volumes he spoke in his silence. Then there was Leo, the firstborn. Leo was his father's charm amplified, but he lacked his father's patience and his grandfather's reverence. Where Ethan saw art, Leo saw inventory. Where Ethan felt a connection to the past, Leo felt the weight of it. He was a natural salesman with a smile that could disarm and a confidence that could command a room. He handled the clients, the finances, the front-of-house operations, and he was brilliant at it. He could sell a simple bookshelf as if it were a priceless heirloom. But he was never truly comfortable in the workshop. The dust made him sneeze, the noise gave him a headache. He saw his brother's talent not as a complimentary gift, but as a quiet judgment on his own perceived lack of tangible skill. He craved a life that was faster, shinier, a life he saw in magazines and on the screens of his expensive phone. This craving was fanned into a flame by his wife, Isabella. She was a woman who measured success in carats and square footage. She saw Miller and Sons not as a legacy to be cherished, but as a stagnant pool of capital. She would often whisper in his ear, her words like a solvent on the glue of his family loyalty, asking why he was content to smell of sawdust when he could smell of success, of money, of power. Their father, Arthur, had seen the differences in his boys. In his final years, he designed his will with the hope of creating a perfect, symbiotic whole. He believed Ethan's soul and skill, combined with Leo's ambition and business acumen, would make Miller and Sons stronger than ever. He envisioned Ethan as the roots and trunk of the tree, solid and unwavering, and Leo as the branches, reaching out into the world. He trusted their shared blood, their shared history, to be the soil that would nourish them both. He tragically misjudged the rot that had already begun to set in. Their mother, Helen, lived in a softer, gentler world, a world curated by memories and old photographs. After her husband's passing, she leaned heavily on her sons. Ethan provided quiet comfort, fixing things around her house, his presence a steady reassurance. But it was Leo who dazzled her. He would visit with extravagant flowers and even more extravagant stories of his success, painting a picture of a thriving business and a brilliant future. He knew how to edit reality for her, shielding her from any financial strains or market downturns, framing his ambition as a noble quest to secure her future. She saw his restlessness as drive, his greed as foresight. In her loving, trusting eyes, Leo could do no wrong. And her signature, on any document he placed before her, was a mere formality of a mother's faith in her brilliant firstborn son. This was the foundation of the Miller family. A legacy of craftsmanship, a father's hopeful dream, a quiet brother's devotion, and a charismatic brother's growing dissatisfaction, all held together by a mother's unsuspecting love. It was a structure that had stood for decades, but one that was about to be brought down, not by an outside force, but by a catastrophic failure from within. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 2 days, Ethan existed in a haze of disbelief, each unanswered call to his brother, chipping away at the desperate hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. He and Clara sat in their small, quiet living room, the air thick with unspoken fears. The scent of coffee grew stale, and the silence was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock, a piece their grandfather had made, each tick a countdown to a truth Ethan wasn't sure he could bear. Finally, on the third evening, headlights swept across the living room window. A car, low-slung and gleaming, a model Ethan had never seen before, purred into his modest driveway. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Leo. He wasn't the brother Ethan knew. The familiar, slightly worn leather jacket was gone, replaced by a tailored navy blue blazer. His shoes shone with an expensive gloss, and a new, ostentatious watch gleamed on his wrist. He walked to the door, not with the shuffling gait of a man bearing bad news, but with the confident stride of a man who had just closed the deal of a lifetime. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Clara opened the door, her face a mask of polite composure, and let him in. Leo nodded at her, a brief, dismissive gesture, his eyes already fixed on Ethan, who sat motionless in his armchair. The confrontation that followed was not one of shouts and accusations. It was far colder, far more brutal than that. It was a dissection performed with the chilling precision of a surgeon who feels nothing for the patient on the table. Ethan's first word was a hoarse whisper. "How?" Leo sighed, a theatrical display of weary patience, as if explaining a complex business strategy to a slow-witted employee. He sat opposite Ethan, placing a sleek leather briefcase on the floor beside him. "It wasn't easy, Ethan, but it was necessary," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Apex Holdings made an offer, an incredible offer, the kind you don't say no to." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "An offer would require 2 signatures. My signature." A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance at having to state the obvious, crossed Leo's face. "A formality," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I signed for you. You would never have seen the logic. You're too attached, too sentimental about every splinter and saw blade. I had to make the executive decision for the both of us, for the good of the family." The casual admission of forgery, of a federal crime, was breathtaking. He said it as if he were admitting to borrowing a tool without asking. "And the legal documents?" Ethan pressed, his voice dangerously low. "The deeds? The partnership agreements? They require notarization, verification." For the first time, Leo's smile seemed a little tight. He reached into his blazer. "Our father was a trusting man," he said, pulling out a folded document. "A little too trusting, perhaps. Remember a few years ago when Mom was having trouble keeping up with her bills after Dad passed? I offered to help her manage her finances, to make sure everything was taken care of." He unfolded the paper. It was a durable power of attorney, granting Leo sweeping control over their mother's financial and legal affairs, including her share of the business trust. It was signed in their mother's familiar, slightly shaky cursive. "She thought she was signing papers for her pension," Leo explained, his voice devoid of any emotion. "She was happy to have me take the burden off her shoulders. With her proxy and my own share, I controlled the majority interest. Your signature, in the end, was a procedural hurdle I simply stepped over. The calculated cruelty of it, the manipulation of their own aging mother, was a physical blow." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a desperate act. This was a meticulously planned heist. Why? It was the only word left. Why would you do this to us? To Dad's memory? This was the moment Leo had been waiting for. He leaned forward, his polished salesman's mask now firmly in place. He began to paint his masterpiece of justification. "Do you have any idea how close we were to going under, Ethan? Really? You're in the back, playing with your chisels, but I'm the one staring at the balance sheets. The market is changing. People want cheap, fast furniture from a box, not handcrafted heirlooms that take a month to build. We were a dinosaur, slowly sinking into the tar pit of nostalgia. I didn't sell our legacy. I cashed it out before it became worthless." He spoke of debt, of rising timber costs, of Ethan's refusal to compromise, to streamline, to create a cheaper, more marketable product line. He twisted Ethan's integrity into a liability, his artistry into a stubborn refusal to adapt. He was the visionary, the savior, and Ethan was the anchor holding him back. Then he delivered the final insult. He clicked open his briefcase and pulled out a crisp, sterile cashier's check. He slid it across the coffee table, the paper whispering against the wood. "This is your share," Leo said, his voice taking on a magnanimous tone. 7 figures, Ethan. More money than you or I would have ever seen in 30 years of running that dusty workshop. We're free. I'm already looking at new ventures. Tech startups, real estate, the kind of businesses that build real wealth, not just memories." Ethan stared at the check. The name of the bank, the typed numbers, the obscene string of zeros. It was the price tag Leo had placed on their grandfather's dream, on their father's life, on their brotherhood. It was the most disgusting thing he had ever seen. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan picked up the check. He didn't look at Leo. He looked at the name Miller and Sons, a ghost now printed on a meaningless document. Then, with a quiet finality, he tore it in half, and then in half again, and again, until the pieces were nothing more than confetti in his trembling hands. He let them fall onto the table. Leo stared, his mouth agape, genuine shock finally breaking through his composure. "Are you insane? That's your future." Ethan finally looked up, and the cold, quiet fury in his eyes made Leo flinch. "That piece of paper is not my future," Ethan said, his voice shaking with a control that was more terrifying than any scream. "You didn't sell a business, Leo. You sold our name. You sold Dad's grave. You sold everything we were. There's not enough money in the world to buy that back." He stood up. "Get out of my house." For a moment, Leo seemed ready to argue, but the look on Ethan's face and the sight of Clara standing silently by the door, her arms crossed, told him there were no more words to be said. He grabbed his briefcase, a sneer of contempt twisting his features. "Fine," he spat. "Stay here and mourn your precious sawdust. Some of us are meant for bigger things. History doesn't pay the bills, little brother. It's time you grew up." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind the wreckage of a family and the torn pieces of a check that represented the price of a soul. The torn pieces of the check lay on the coffee table like a pile of dead leaves, the final, pathetic remnants of a brotherhood that had been clear-cut and sold for timber. The silence Leo left behind was heavier than any sound, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and a future that had just been violently erased. Ethan sank back into his armchair, the energy that had fueled his defiance draining away, leaving him hollow. He stared at the hands in his lap, the same hands that had learned to shape wood at his father's side, and for the first time in his life, they felt useless. Clara moved quietly from the doorway, her presence a silent comfort. She knelt before him, not speaking, but simply began to gather the scattered pieces of the check, her movements slow and deliberate. She swept them into her hand and closed her fist around them, as if to contain the poison they represented. She then placed her other hand on Ethan's knee, a small, warm point of contact in his cold, vast emptiness. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, and the genuine pain in her voice, the shared weight of his sorrow, was what finally broke him. A single, hot tear traced a path through the faint layer of sawdust on his cheek. He hadn't just lost a business. He had lost the entire map of his life. The story, as stories of betrayal often do, did not remain contained within those four walls. It seeped out, first as a trickle, then as a flood. The following days were a cascade of phone calls, each one forcing Ethan to relive the wound. His Aunt Carol called, her voice trembling with confusion. "Ethan, honey, Leo just posted photos of a new Mercedes. He said he's celebrating a big company expansion. What's happening?" How could he explain that the expansion was an extinction? His cousin Mark, who had worked in the workshop one summer, was livid. "He did what? That's grand larceny. You have to sue him, Ethan. You have to destroy him." But other calls were different. His Uncle Robert, a man who had always viewed the world through a calculator, was frustratingly pragmatic. "Listen, kid," he'd said, his voice tinny over the phone. 7 figures is 7 figures. Maybe you should have just taken the money. A bird in the hand, you know." The family was fracturing along an invisible line, a line that separated those who understood value from those who only understood price. But the most important call, the one he both dreaded and needed to make, was the one to his mother. He couldn't let her hear a twisted version from Leo. He drove to her house, the house he grew up in, a living museum of Miller and Sons craftsmanship. The grandfather clock in the hall, the dining table where they'd shared thousands of meals, the very banister he slid down. As a boy, he and his father had built or finished nearly every piece. It was a home held together by the very legacy Leo had just liquidated. Helen met him at the door with a worried smile. "Ethan, I was just about to call you. Leo told me the most wonderful news. He said the business has a new investor, a big corporation. He said now you'll finally have time to rest." The words, so full of innocent pride, were like a punch to the gut. Leo hadn't just lied. He had woven a complete, alternate reality and placed their mother gently in the center of it. Ethan sat her down at the dining table, the polished oak cool beneath his trembling hands. "Mom," he began, his voice strained. "That's not what happened. There's no investor. Leo, he sold the company. He sold everything." He explained it all, as gently as he could. The forged signature, the sale to Apex Holdings, the locked doors. He watched his mother's face, searching for the dawning horror, the outrage, the maternal protection he so desperately needed. He saw none of it. Instead, her brow furrowed in confusion, and then a heartbreaking defensiveness. "Sold it?" she repeated, shaking her head. No, he restructured. "He told me all about it. He said you were worried, Ethan, that you were too stressed. He said this was to protect us, to secure our future. He saved us from going into debt." She was reciting a script, Leo's script. "Mom, he lied to you," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. "He used a power of attorney you signed to do it. He tricked you. He had expected this to be the final, undeniable proof of Leo's villainy. Instead, Helen's face hardened. Tricked me? Don't be ridiculous. Leo helps me with my paperwork. He's a good son. He looks after me." To acknowledge the trick would be to acknowledge her own fading sharpness, her own vulnerability. It was a truth too terrifying for her to face. Her denial became an accusation. "Your father, God rest his soul, always said you were the stubborn one," she said, her voice rising, laced with tears. "You were never happy. You never wanted to modernize, to change. Leo had to do something. His hands were tied. You're just jealous because he was brave enough to make a decision you were too scared to make." That was the final blow. Jealous. She thought this was about pride, about money. She couldn't see that it was about love, about memory, about soul. He had come to his mother for an ally and found a mouthpiece for his betrayer. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. There was nothing left to say. He had lost her, too. He left his childhood home feeling more like an orphan than he ever had after his father's death. The contrast to his own grief was obscene. Leo and Isabella were broadcasting their new life across social media. There they were, clinking champagne glasses on a dealership floor next to not one, but two new luxury cars. There was a selfie from a five-star restaurant, Isabella flaunting a new diamond bracelet. Her caption read, "To the man who builds empires, so proud of my brilliant husband for making the tough calls. Number success, number new beginnings, number levels." They were not just celebrating their wealth, they were celebrating the very act of betrayal. They had wrapped themselves in a cocoon of money and arrogance, impervious to the pain they had caused. Isabella told Leo that his family was simply provincial, unable to comprehend his level of ambition. She convinced him that their jealousy was a confirmation of his success. That night, Ethan sat in his own garage, the small space he had started to turn into a makeshift workshop. He was surrounded by his own tools, the few things that were truly his. He felt the weight of it all, the loss of his brother, his mother, his heritage. He was an island, and the tide of his old life had receded, leaving him completely stranded. Clara came in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it would all be okay. She just sat with him in the silence, on an overturned bucket. After a long while, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "His name was on the sign, Ethan, but the legacy is in your hands. Literally. Your family might be broken, but our family, this family, right here, it's not. And we will build something new, something they can never, ever sell." The weeks that followed were a thick, gray fog. For a man who had built his life around purpose and precision, the sudden absence of both was a crushing weight. Ethan's hands, usually dusted with the fine powder of sanded wood, were now clean, soft, and utterly foreign to him. He'd wake in the pre-dawn darkness, his body still tuned to the rhythm of a craftsman's day, but there was nowhere to go. The phantom hum of the table saw echoed in his ears, a ghost limb of a life that had been amputated. His identity was not just tied to Miller and Sons, it was carved from it. He was a miller who worked wood. Without the wood, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. He spent most of his days in the garage, his small collection of personal tools hanging neatly on the walls. They were a silent, orderly audience to his inertia. He'd pick up a chisel, feel its familiar weight, trace the maker's mark with his thumb, and then set it back down, the creative impulse that once connected his mind to his hands, now a dead circuit. The tools seemed to mock him, gleaming with a potential he no longer felt capable of unlocking. He was a musician in a soundproof room, a painter who had become colorblind. Clara watched him with a growing sense of dread. He was physically present, but his spirit was adrift. He moved through their home like a shadow, his conversations reduced to monosyllables. She would try to draw him out, suggesting walks, a movie, anything to break the spell of the garage. But he would just shake his head, his eyes fixed on some distant point she couldn't see. Her husband, a man of quiet strength, was hollowed out, and his silence was no longer the comfortable quiet of a man at peace with his work, but the vast, empty silence of true despair. The deepest cut, however, was yet to come. It arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a garish, bright yellow flyer stuck in their mailbox. Public liquidation sale, the bold letters screamed. Apex Holdings announces the complete asset sale of Miller & Sons Fine Woods. All equipment, tools, and lumber must go. Unbelievable prices. An address and a date were listed below. It was an obituary, printed on cheap paper. He felt a nauseous pull, the horrified magnetism of a wound you know you shouldn't look at, but can't turn away from. On the day of the sale, he told Clara he was going for a drive. He didn't tell her where. He couldn't. He parked his truck across the street from the workshop, under the shade of an old oak tree, a silent, anonymous mourner at his own funeral. The scene was a desecration. The great workshop doors, which had always been open to welcome clients in the morning sun, were propped wide, a gaping maw disgorging the soul of his family. A crowd of strangers, like vultures, picked through the remains. He watched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, as a man in a greasy t-shirt haggled over the price of his grandfather's German-made jointer, a machine so perfectly calibrated that Ethan could shave a whisper of wood from a board. The man slapped its cast-iron top and grunted, "I'll give you $200 for this old beast." The workbench his father had built, its surface a geography of 30 years of labor gouges, from slipped chisels, rings from forgotten coffee cups, a faint carving of his and Leo's initials from a bored afternoon in their childhood, was sold to a man who planned to use it for potting plants in his garden. He saw them carrying out the lumber, the precious, hoarded stock his father had called their library of possibilities. Towering slabs of burled walnut, planks of bird's eye maple he'd been saving for over a decade, fragrant Spanish cedar. They were sold by the board foot to hobbyists and flippers, their incredible potential reduced to a commodity, their stories silenced forever. The most painful moment came when he saw a young man, barely out of his teens, pick up a small, rosewood-handled hand plane from a dusty box of miscellaneous tools. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It had been his grandfather's favorite, the first tool Elias had ever allowed him to use. The boy turned it over, unimpressed, and tossed it back into the box with a careless clatter of metal on metal. In that moment, Ethan's grief curdled into something else. It was a cold, pure, impotent rage. He wanted to storm across the street, to scream at these people, to tell them they weren't just buying tools and wood, they were buying his history, his memories, his very blood. But he was powerless. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life, and all he could do was watch as the bones were picked clean. That night, he was worse than ever. He didn't go to the garage. He sat in the darkened living room, staring at a blank television screen. When Clara came to him, putting a hand on his shoulder, he didn't respond. "Ethan, please talk to me," she begged, her voice thick with worry. For a long time, there was nothing. Then he spoke, his voice a raw, broken thing. "They sold his plane for $5, Clara." He didn't need to say whose. A man bought Dad's workbench to put flower pots on. He said it had a nice, rustic look. He finally turned to her, and his eyes were not just filled with sadness, but with a terrifying emptiness. "It's all gone. There's nothing left." Clara knew then that cheerful encouragement would be an insult to the depth of his pain. She couldn't fix this. All she could do was bear witness. She sat on the floor at his feet, leaning her head against his knee, and just stayed there with him in the dark. She didn't say it would be all right. She didn't say they would get through it. She just stayed, a silent promise that he was not entirely alone in the wreckage. They sat like that for hours, and as the dawn began to creep through the blinds, something inside Ethan began to shift. The crushing weight of despair was still there, but beneath it, a tiny ember of the rage he had felt across the street began to glow once more. Despair was a quiet, drowning pool, but rage, he was beginning to remember, was a fire. It was a fuel. The image of his grandfather's plane being tossed aside, of his father's bench being devalued, of Leo's smiling face on social media, it all began to coalesce, not into sadness, but into a cold, hard resolve. He had reached the bottom. There was nowhere to go but up. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when. But as he looked at his wife's head resting on his knee, her unwavering, silent support his only anchor, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end of the story. The fog of despair did not lift all at once. It receded slowly, like a morning mist burning off under the first rays of an unexpected Sunday. That sun, for Ethan, was Clara. She did not try to fill his silence with noise or his emptiness with false optimism. Instead, she brought him truth. One evening, she found him in the garage, staring blankly at a hook on the wall where a favorite saw used to hang. She didn't say a word, but simply placed a small, rough-sawn block of maple into his hands. He looked at it, then at her, his expression confused. "Leo sold the workshop," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He sold the tools, he sold the lumber, he sold the sign with your family's name on it. But he couldn't sell this." She gently touched his fingers, closing them around the block of wood. "He couldn't sell the knowledge in your head. He couldn't sell the strength in your hands. And he couldn't sell the memory of your father teaching you how to read the grain. That is the true inheritance, Ethan. That is the one thing that belongs only to you." Her words didn't magically heal him, but they shifted something deep inside. They were a key, turning a lock he didn't even realize had rusted shut. Later that night, long after Clara had gone to bed, Ethan remained in the garage, the small block of maple still in his hand. He turned it over and over, feeling its weight, its texture, its potential. He looked down at his own hands. For weeks, he had seen them as symbols of his loss, idle and purposeless. But now, in the dim light of the single bare bulb, he saw them as Clara did. He saw the map of his life written in their lines, the faded scar from his first slip, with the chisel at age 10, the thick calluses built from decades of gripping a saw, the faint, permanent stain of wood finished deep in the whorls of his fingerprints. These hands held the entire legacy. Leo had sold the vessel, the physical shell of the business, but the soul of it, the actual skill and knowledge, was right here. It was in his muscle memory, in his mind's eye, in his very DNA. A new feeling, unfamiliar and powerful, began to displace the grief. It was not the hot, impotent rage he had felt before. It was a cold, quiet resolve. The thought dropped into his mind, fully formed and shockingly clear. He wasn't going to sue Leo for the money. That would be playing Leo's game, by Leo's rules, acknowledging that the number on a check was a fair price for a soul. Number, he was going to get it back. All of it. Not just a business, but his business. Not just a building, but his workshop. The idea was insane, impossible. He had no capital, no assets, no legal standing. But it was the first thing in months that had made him feel alive. The craftsman, dormant within him, had just been given a new project, the most complex and important of his life, the restoration of his own future. The first rule of woodworking is to know your material. Ethan realized the same principle applied here. He needed to understand his opponents. That night, he sat at their kitchen table, the glow of Clara's laptop illuminating his face. He started with Apex Holdings. He spent hours falling down a rabbit hole of financial reports, news articles, and online forums. A clear and brutal picture emerged. Apex was a corporate piranha. Their business model was simple. Find a legacy business with valuable real estate, leverage the assets, fire the staff, sell off the equipment, and flip the property for a quick, massive profit. He read about a family-owned bakery in Ohio, a beloved community print shop in Pennsylvania, a historic auto garage in their own state. In every case, the story was the same. Apex was not in the business of building anything. They were in the business of demolition. They were impatient. Their entire model depended on speed, and in that impatience, Ethan saw their weakness. Apex wouldn't want to hold on to a property that became difficult or unprofitable to sell. They would cut their losses and move on to the next victim. The workshop, his sacred ground, was just another line item on their balance sheet, and a line item they would want to erase as quickly as possible. Next, he turned his attention to his brother. It was painful, but he forced himself to scroll through Leo's and Isabella's social media feeds, not as a wounded sibling, but as a researcher gathering data. He saw the barrage of conspicuous consumption, the extravagant watches, the designer clothes, the exclusive restaurants where the price of a single meal could have paid for a cord of premium oak. He read Leo's posts, full of buzzwords like synergy, disruption, and next-level paradigms, all of it a smokescreen of jargon to hide the fact that he wasn't creating anything. He was just spending. Ethan, who had been taught to measure twice and cut once, who understood that true value is built slowly over time, recognized his brother's behavior for what it was, a fool's gold rush. Leo was burning through the money, not investing it. He was treating a finite resource as if it were an infinite spring, driven by his own ego and Isabella's insatiable appetite for status. Leo wasn't building an empire. He was throwing a very expensive party, and Ethan knew, with the certainty of a carpenter checking if a board is level, that the party would eventually have to end. He would go bankrupt. It was not a matter of if, but when. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the kitchen window, Ethan closed the laptop. He hadn't slept, but a profound sense of calm had settled over him. The despair was gone, replaced by a steely-eyed patience. He now had the blueprint for his impossible project. It would not be a swift and angry revenge. It would be a slow, meticulous act of restoration. He was a craftsman. He would treat this challenge like any other piece of fine furniture. He would be patient. He would be precise. He would measure every move. And he would build his victory, piece by piece, right under their noses, until it was solid, undeniable, and his once more. Ethan knew that a direct assault was impossible. Apex Holdings was a fortress of lawyers and capital, and Leo was insulated by a wall of cash and delusion. To fight them on their terms would be financial suicide. A craftsman doesn't fell a giant tree with a single furious swing of an axe. He uses a small, sharp blade and patiently, precisely, cuts the line where it is destined to fall. So, Ethan began his long, quiet work. The first step was one of profound humility. He needed income, a steady flow of it, to keep his and Clara's life afloat while he laid the groundwork for his real plan. Through an old acquaintance, he took a job with a construction crew, framing new houses in a sprawling suburban development. The work was grueling, a world away from the artistry of the workshop. Here, speed was valued over precision. Nail guns replaced dovetail joints, and pine 2x4s replaced polished mahogany. He was no longer a master craftsman. He was just another body on a crew, his days measured in square footage and deadlines. His crewmates, unaware of his past, saw him as a quiet, unusually skilled carpenter who kept to himself. They had no idea that the man expertly installing kitchen cabinets had, just a few months prior, been designing and building furniture that cost more than their trucks. Ethan swallowed his pride. He welcomed the physical exhaustion, the way it scoured his mind of obsessive thoughts about Leo. Every paycheck he earned was a small victory, a clean dollar earned through hard, honest labor. It was the foundation. In the evenings and on weekends, his garage, once a cell of despair, transformed into a sanctuary of creation. He meticulously organized his limited space, building clever, space-saving storage for his tools and lumber. He took a piece of scrap cherry wood and, with the careful precision of a man engraving a headstone, he carved a small, simple sign. It didn't say Miller. That name was tainted, for now. It said Legacy Woods. It was a promise to himself. This was not just a side business. It was the continuation. He began by making a list, not of potential customers, but of old friends. He sifted through years of Miller and Sons invoices, picking out the names of the most loyal, long-standing clients, the ones who had known his father, and in some cases, his grandfather. His first call was to an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, for whom his father had built a complete dining set 30 years ago. He didn't call to sell her anything. He simply asked how she was doing and how the furniture was holding up. The conversation was the first test of his new narrative. When she asked about the business, Ethan took a breath. Miller and Sons is going through a significant corporate restructuring, he said, his voice calm and even. They're moving in a more commercial direction. I've decided to step away from the corporate side to focus personally on the kind of custom, handcrafted projects that my father and grandfather always valued. He didn't speak a single word of slander against Leo. He didn't mention the betrayal or the theft. He framed his new venture not as a desperate beginning, but as a deliberate choice to uphold a standard of quality. He was positioning himself as the guardian of the flame, the sole keeper of the true Miller way. Mrs. Gable, who distrusted corporations and valued heritage, understood immediately. A week later, she called back. A leg on one of the dining chairs, the one her late husband always sat in, had developed a wobble. Could Ethan possibly look at it? It was a small job, but for Ethan, it was everything. He brought the chair back to his garage and treated it not as a simple repair, but as a sacred trust. He documented the process, taking photos of the intricate joinery his father had crafted. He carefully disassembled the joint, cleaned away the old, failed glue, and put it back together with a precision that would make it stronger than it had been before. When he returned the chair, he also brought a small container of custom-blended wax polish and a soft cloth. He showed Mrs. Gable how to care for the wood, sharing a story his father had told him about that particular set of cherry. He charged her a modest, almost symbolic fee. She paid him double and gave him a plate of homemade cookies. More importantly, she told her friends. Word of mouth began to spread through a very specific, very influential circle in their community. The story was compelling. Ethan Miller, the real talent behind the family name, was now working independently, a lone artisan preserving the old ways. The calls started to trickle in. A lawyer who had bought a desk from his father needed a set of matching bookshelves. A young couple, for whom Miller and Sons was an unaffordable dream, wanted to commission a single, beautiful, handcrafted rocking chair for their nursery. An architect, who had previously sourced pieces from the old company, now contacted Ethan directly for custom fittings in a historic home renovation. With each project, Ethan's confidence grew. He worked with a singular, quiet focus. Every piece that left his garage was flawless, a silent ambassador for his skill and integrity. He delivered every item himself, building a personal connection with each client. They weren't just buying furniture. They were buying a piece of his story, a piece of the true legacy. He managed his finances with the same precision he managed his woodworking. Every dollar earned was carefully logged. He and Clara lived frugally, banking every spare cent. He was building his war chest, not with a single massive influx of cash like Leo, but slowly, steadily, with the proceeds of real work. He no longer wasted his energy checking his brother's social media. He was too busy. His focus was on his own bench, on the tool in his hand, on the client he had promised to deliver to next week. His revenge was taking shape, not in a flurry of angry legal letters, but in the quiet rasp of a saw cutting through oak, in the satisfaction of a perfectly fitted joint, and in the growing chorus of clients who would say, "If you want the real Miller quality, you have to go to Ethan." He was rebuilding the family business from the ground up. But this time, it would be built on a foundation that could never be stolen. His own two hands, and a reputation that was becoming, once again, priceless. While Ethan was quietly laying the foundation of his new life, one solid, well-sanded board at a time, His brother Leo was building a castle in the clouds, unaware that its foundations were nothing but smoke. The money from the sale of Miller and Sons was a vast, intoxicating ocean, and Leo, who had spent his life in the shallows, promptly dove into the deep end, convinced he was a master swimmer. He and Isabella moved into a stark, minimalist mansion with more glass than walls, a place that felt less like a home and more like a modern art gallery for two. They threw lavish parties where the guests, a collection of equally new money and the sycophants it attracts, spoke in a dizzying lexicon of portfolios, assets, and disruptive technologies. Leo, once a seller of fine furniture, now fashioned himself a venture capitalist, a visionary. He would stand on his marble terrace, a ridiculously expensive scotch in hand, and speak grandly of market fluidity and paradigm shifts, a man utterly mesmerized by the sound of his own invented expertise. Isabella, meanwhile, curated their life for an audience of thousands on social media. Her days were a blur of high-end boutique shopping, spa treatments, and lunches at restaurants where the food was less important than the clientele. She hired and fired interior decorators with the changing seasons, believing that a home, like a wardrobe, should be constantly updated. Her mantra, whispered to Leo over silk pillows, was simple. "You have to spend money to project success, darling. No one invests in a man who drives last year's model." Their life was a performance, and the cost of admission was astronomical. The steady, relentless drain of Isabella's lifestyle was a slow leak in their financial reservoir. But the catastrophic breach came in the form of a man named Julian Vance. They met him at a charity auction, a place designed for new money to prove its existence. Julian was everything Leo aspired to be: impeccably dressed, effortlessly charming, and fluent in the language of easy wealth. He presented himself as a boutique financial advisor, a wealth whisperer for a select, discerning clientele. He saw the desperation for legitimacy in Leo's eyes and the hunger for status in Isabella's, and he knew he had found his perfect marks. Julian didn't talk about slow, steady growth or diversified portfolios. That was for old money, he'd say, with a conspiratorial wink. The new way, the fast way, was through bold, decisive moves. He started Leo off small, introducing him to a revolutionary new cryptocurrency. It was all hype and no substance, but Julian, along with a network of online accomplices, orchestrated a classic pump and dump scheme. Leo, intoxicated by the initial surge in value and terrified of looking ignorant, poured a substantial six-figure sum into the digital ether. For a week, he felt like a genius, watching his investment double on a screen. Then, overnight, it collapsed, plummeting by 98%. Julian was ready with a comforting explanation. "Volatility is the price of admission, Leo. We win some, we lose some. The important thing is to not get spooked and to pivot to the next opportunity." The next opportunity was even more alluring. Julian offered Leo an exclusive, pre-IPO stake in a Silicon Valley tech startup called Viridian Dynamics. He claimed it was the next big thing in AI-driven logistics. He showed Leo a slick website and forged documents detailing incredible profit projections. The catch was that the investment had to be made immediately, in cash, before the institutional investors caught wind of it. Leo, desperate to recoup his crypto losses and prove he was still a player, didn't hesitate. He wired an even larger sum to an offshore account, dreaming of the day he'd be profiled in business magazines as an early backer. He was buying a ghost story, a company that existed only as a single web page and a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. Isabella, blissfully unaware of the details, only encouraged him. "Of course it's a risk, darling," she'd say, examining her new diamond earrings in the mirror. "All the great men are risk takers." The final, fatal blow was a real estate development project named the Elysian Tower. Julian presented it as the investment of a lifetime, a shimmering skyscraper of luxury condos in a rapidly gentrifying part of the city. He had glossy brochures, 3D architectural renderings, and a fabricated list of celebrity residents who had already bought in. He told Leo that the project needed one more founding partner to close the final round of financing. It required a massive, 7-figure capital investment, but it would grant him a significant percentage of the entire project. This was it, the move that would cement the Miller name, his Miller name, as a force in the city. It was the ultimate validation. He liquidated most of his remaining stock portfolio and poured the last of the truly liquid cash from the Miller & Sons sale into the Elysian Tower. The first cracks in their perfect glass house began to appear subtly. A platinum credit card was declined at a restaurant. Isabella laughed it off as a technical glitch. A notice arrived from the bank about an overdrawn account. Leo hid it before she could see it. He became jumpy, constantly checking his phone, his feigned confidence now underpinned by a frantic, nervous energy. He tried calling Julian to get an update on Viridian dynamics, but his calls started going straight to voicemail. The party was ending, and the harsh, sober light of reality was beginning to dawn. The breaking point came on a gray, drizzly afternoon. Anxious and unable to reach Julian for over a week, Leo drove to the address listed for the future site of the Elysian Tower. He expected to see cranes, construction crews, the first signs of his new empire. Instead, he found a desolate, rain-soaked vacant lot, choked with weeds and littered with trash. A single, dilapidated chain-link fence surrounded the property. On it, a faded, rust-stained sign from a local realtor offered the land for sale. It had been on the market for 3 years. He stood there, in the rain, staring at the empty field. There was no tower, there was no project, there was no investment, there was nothing. He frantically dialed Julian's number again. This time, he didn't even get voicemail. A sterile, automated voice simply said, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." The truth hit him then, a physical, sickening impact. He had traded it all: his father's legacy, his brother's trust, the solid, tangible reality of 100 years of craftsmanship for a slick brochure, a ghost company, and a worthless, muddy field. The ocean of money was gone. He was no longer a swimmer. He was just a fool who had just discovered he was miles from shore, with nothing left to do but drown. While Leo's world was imploding in a spectacular, self-inflicted firestorm, Ethan's was quietly, deliberately taking shape. His days were spent in the familiar rhythm of his craft, the scent of sawdust, a constant, comforting presence. But his evenings were dedicated to a different kind of project, one that required the same patience and precision as a complex piece of joinery. He had become a master of listening. The network of clients he was building was more than a source of income, it was a web of information. A casual conversation with a client who worked in the city planning office yielded a crucial piece of intelligence. The man mentioned a recent headache for a big developer, Apex Holdings. An anonymous, meticulously researched tip had been sent to the Historical Preservation Committee, citing obscure zoning bylaws from the 1950 seconds that designated the old industrial district, including the workshops plot, as a potential heritage zone. Any new construction or significant alteration would now be subject to a lengthy and expensive review process. The client grumbled about bureaucratic red tape, but Ethan just nodded thoughtfully, a faint, knowing light in his eyes. He had spent a full weekend in the public library a month earlier, poring over dusty city archives. He knew the history of that land better than anyone, and he had used that legacy, that deep knowledge, as a silent, invisible weapon. He had turned Apex's prime real estate asset into a toxic liability. More whispers came from other corners. A lumber supplier he had known for years mentioned that he'd seen Leo's new Mercedes listed for private sale online at a steep discount. An old family friend called, asking if Ethan knew that Leo had tried to borrow a substantial amount of money from him, telling a wild story about a temporary cash flow problem with an overseas investment. Each story was another data point, confirming Ethan's hypothesis. Leo wasn't just failing. He was in a financial freefall, desperately trying to shed weight before he hit the ground. The time to set the final pieces in motion had arrived. Ethan made an appointment with Samuel Blackwood, his father's lawyer and oldest friend. Samuel was a formidable man in his 70s, with eyes that had seen every form of human greed and folly. He had been quietly disappointed when Arthur left the business to both sons, having always believed Leo's ambition was a dangerous, corrosive thing. Ethan laid out his entire plan on the polished mahogany desk in Samuel's office, a desk Ethan's own father had built. He presented his research on Apex's business model, their impatience. He showed Samuel the news of their stalled property sale. He detailed Leo's erratic behavior and financial desperation. And finally, he presented a bank statement showing the sum of money he and Clara had painstakingly saved from the earnings of Legacy Woods. It wasn't a fortune, but it was clean, hard-earned, and liquid. Samuel listened without interruption, his fingertips steepled. When Ethan was finished, the old lawyer was silent for a long time. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Your father was a master craftsman, Ethan," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He knew how to build things that would last. It seems he passed that on to one of his sons, after all. Not just in wood, but in character." Samuel agreed to help, not just for a fee, but for Arthur. He saw this as a final act of service to his departed friend, a chance to restore the balance that Leo had shattered. A week later, a new entity was officially incorporated: Phoenix Restorations, LLC. Ethan signed the documents as the sole director. He had chosen the name carefully. As he explained to Samuel, this wasn't about revenge, it was about rebirth. It was about bringing his family's legacy back from the ashes of his brother's greed. The name was a mission statement. Funding the company was an exercise in monastic discipline. He and Clara had made a pact. They sold their second car, an older but reliable sedan. They canceled a planned anniversary trip. Every spare dollar from Legacy Woods, every cent saved from their frugal budget, was funneled into the Phoenix Restorations bank account. It was a stark contrast. Leo had started with a massive lump sum from a single act of betrayal, while Ethan was building his war chest with thousands of small transactions, each one representing an hour of honest work, a satisfied customer, a promise kept. His money had integrity. His money had memory. With Samuel's guidance, they watched and waited. It was a silent, tense vigil. Samuel's contacts in the commercial real estate world confirmed that Apex was getting agitated. The holding costs for the workshop property taxes, insurance, security were adding up. The zoning review was snarled in committees, with no clear end in sight. The property had become a financial bleed, a blot on their quarterly report. They were no longer looking for a big profit, they were looking for an exit. Meanwhile, news of Leo had all but disappeared. His social media went silent. There were no more posts of lavish dinners or new toys. He had gone to ground, a supernova that had collapsed into a black hole, his pride and his finances equally decimated. Ethan stood in his garage late one night, the air cool and smelling of cedar. He ran a handplane over a length of tiger maple, watching a perfect paper-thin curl of wood rise from the blade. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still a simple craftsman, working alone in his small shop, building things for people who appreciated quality. But beneath that quiet surface, the trap was now fully assembled. The bait, a lowball, all-cash, no contingency offer was ready. The legal mechanism of Phoenix Restorations was in place. The target, Apex Holdings, was wounded and impatient, and the ghost of his brother was too broke and too humiliated to even be a factor. All that was left was the timing. Like waiting for the glue on a complex joint to cure, all he could do now was wait for the perfect moment of weakness to make his move. For Leo Miller, the end did not come as a single, dramatic explosion, but as a series of quiet, humiliating surrenders. The slick performance of his new life was over, and the creditors were the crew that came to dismantle the set. It began with the cars. The gleaming Mercedes he had paraded as a trophy was repossessed from the parking lot of a cheap motel he'd been staying in. A few weeks later, the glass mansion, now a cold and empty monument to his folly, was foreclosed upon by the bank, its contents to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. But the most significant repossession, the one that signaled his final, utter bankruptcy, was the departure of his wife. The scene was not one of tearful farewells. It was a cold, efficient transaction. Isabella, her face a mask of bored contempt, supervised as movers packed her designer clothes and jewelry into a waiting van. She had already secured a new life, latching onto another wealthy man she'd met during their brief time in the social stratosphere. Leo, gaunt and unshaven, tried to appeal to her one last time. "Izzy, don't do this," he pleaded, his voice raspy. "It's a temporary setback. I can fix this. We can fix this." Isabella paused, turning to him with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "There is no we, Leo," she said, her voice as crisp as a new $100 bill. "I signed up for the man who was building an empire, not the one who was living in a fantasy. You didn't lose your money. You lost your nerve. There's a difference." She picked a piece of lint from her cashmere coat. "My advice? Go back to what you know. Maybe your brother will give you a job sweeping up sawdust." With that, she walked out of his life, leaving him alone in an echoing, empty house that was no longer his. Rock bottom, Leo discovered, was a cold, hard, and lonely place. After exhausting every other option, after being turned down by every fair-weather friend, he was left with only one desperate, final gambit. Late one night, a figure emerged from the shadows and walked up the modest driveway to Ethan and Clara's home. It was a ghost of the man he once was. The tailored blazer was gone, replaced by a frayed, ill-fitting jacket. The confident stride had become a defeated shuffle. When Ethan opened the door, he barely recognized the haunted, hollowed-out stranger standing on his porch. Leo didn't even wait to be invited in. He stumbled past Ethan and collapsed onto the small sofa in their living room, burying his face in his hands. The dam of his false pride finally broke, and a torrent of pathetic, self-pitying sobs filled the quiet room. He cried about being cheated by Julian, about the bad luck of the market, about the cruelty of Isabella. He painted himself as the victim, a tragic hero struck down by a cruel and unjust world. He never once said the words, "I was wrong." When the tears subsided, the begging began. "Ethan, I have nothing," he whimpered, his eyes red and swollen. "They took everything. I'm sleeping in my car. Please. You're my brother. You have to help me, just a loan. 10,000? 5? Enough to get a place, to get back on my feet. I'll pay you back. I swear on Dad's memory." He dared to invoke their father's name, the ultimate blasphemy. Ethan stood there, his arms crossed, Clara a silent, steady presence at his side. He listened to the entire, wretched performance without a word. He let the silence hang in the air after Leo's plea, letting his brother feel the full weight of his degradation. Finally, when Leo looked up, his eyes pleading, Ethan gave his answer. It was quiet, devoid of anger or triumph. It was simply a fact. Number. The word, so small, so final, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Leo stared, his mouth agape. "No? What do you mean, no? I'm your brother." "My brother," Ethan replied, his voice as cold and hard as steel, "sold our family for cash. The man who did that is a stranger to me. You made your choices, Leo, every single one of them. Now you have to live with them." He opened the front door. "You should go." At that exact moment, across town, a different conversation was taking place. Samuel Blackwood sat in his dimly lit office, his voice a calm, professional murmur on the speakerphone. On the other end was the chief counsel for Apex Holdings. "As I've stated," Samuel said, "my client, Phoenix Restorations, is prepared to offer a single, all-cash payment for the property. We are aware of the zoning complications and the associated holding costs you are incurring. Our offer reflects those realities." The offer was, by any measure, a lowball. It was barely half of what Apex had paid Leo. The lawyer on the other end scoffed, a reflexive negotiating tactic. "That's an insulting offer, Mr. Blackwood." Samuel didn't flinch. "It's a firm offer," he countered smoothly. "And it expires at 9 a.m. tomorrow. My client can have the funds wired and the paperwork closed by noon. You can have this liability off your books before the end of the fiscal quarter. Or you can continue to let it bleed money for the foreseeable future while the city council debates. The choice is yours." He said nothing more. The silence was his greatest negotiating tool. On the other end of the line, a frantic, muted conversation took place. Calculations were made. The cost of continued litigation versus the certainty of cash in hand. the embarrassment of a loss versus the strategic benefit of cleaning up the books. For a soulless corporation like Apex, the decision was simple arithmetic, stripped of all emotion. The lawyer came back on the line, his tone now devoid of bluster. "We have a deal," he said. A defeated, broken Leo stumbled away from Ethan's front porch, disappearing into the darkness, a man with no past and no future. As the door clicked shut, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text from Samuel Blackwood. The message was 5 words long. "The Phoenix has landed." In the quiet of his living room, with his wife by his side, Ethan closed his eyes. He had not raised his voice. He had not exacted a violent revenge. He had simply outlasted the storm. And now, in the calm that followed, he had reclaimed his world. The keys felt both foreign and familiar in Ethan's hand. As he unlocked the doors to his workshop, and pushed them open, the smell of stale, dead air greeted him. Apex Holdings had been thorough. The space was cavernous and empty, stripped of every machine, every bench, every last scrap of lumber. They had taken the body, and in doing so, had stolen its soul. But Ethan knew something they didn't. The soul of this place wasn't in the machines, it was in the floorboards, stained with generations of varnish, in the high windows that caught the morning light just so, in the very bones of the building. And so began the slow, sacred work of restoration. It took him 3 months. 3 months of labor that was more than just construction. It was a form of prayer. He spent the first week just cleaning, sweeping away the dust and debris, washing the grime from the windows, letting the light and air back in. He patched the holes in the walls, sanded the floors by hand to remove the scars of the liquidation, and refinished them until they shone with a deep, warm luster. He did not buy new equipment all at once. Instead, he scoured auctions and estate sales, patiently hunting for vintage cast-iron machines like the ones his father and grandfather had trusted, machines with history and heft. He found a new table saw, an old lathe, a sturdy bandsaw. Each piece was lovingly restored, calibrated, and given a place of honor in the workshop. It was a painstaking resurrection, piece by piece. Clara was there every weekend, painting the office, planting flowers in the neglected window boxes out front, her steady presence a quiet affirmation of their shared mission. One day, she found him running his hand over a massive workbench he had just finished building, his face a mixture of exhaustion and profound satisfaction. "You're not just rebuilding a workshop, are you?" she said softly. He looked at her, and his eyes were clearer than they had been in a year. "I'm rebuilding the foundation," he replied. "The right way, this time." The final touch was the sign. He took a magnificent 8-foot slab of reclaimed redwood and carved the new name himself, the letters deep and strong. It didn't say Miller and Sons. The and Sons had been a partnership, a promise that had been broken. His new sign read, simply, Miller's Legacy. It was a declaration. The legacy was not a birthright to be shared or sold. It was a standard to be upheld. For the grand reopening, he didn't send out glossy invitations or alert the press. He made a few dozen personal phone calls. He invited his most loyal Legacy Woods clients, his most trusted suppliers, and the scattered remnants of his family. He invited his Aunt Carol, his cousin Mark, and even his Uncle Robert. And, in the hardest phone call he had to make, he invited his mother, telling her to please bring Leo. He needed them to be there. He needed them to bear witness. The day of the event was bright and cool. The workshop was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and lemon polish. The restored machines gleamed. Finished pieces of furniture, the first fruits of the new workshop, were displayed like sculptures in a gallery. The guests spoke in hushed, reverent tones, marveling at the transformation. Then, his mother arrived, leaning on Leo's arm. Helen looked frail, her eyes darting around, confused. Leo was a ghost. He was thin, dressed in borrowed clothes, and his eyes were dull, completely devoid of their old, charismatic spark. He looked at the restored workshop with a vacant expression, unable to process what he was seeing. When everyone had gathered, Ethan stepped into the center of the room, wiping his hands on a clean rag. He was not wearing a suit, but his simple work clothes. He was home. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and clear, echoing slightly in the large space. "A lot of you know what has happened over the past year. You know that Miller and Sons was sold. You know that this place was emptied out and left for dead." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, finally resting on his mother and brother. "I've heard a lot of stories and a lot of rumors about what happened. So I wanted you all to be here today, to hear the truth. The company that bought this property from Apex Holdings a few months ago is a small, private firm called Phoenix Restorations." He let the name hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, quiet blow. "And I am Phoenix Restorations." A collective gasp went through the room. He saw his Uncle Robert's jaw drop. He saw his mother's hand fly to her mouth. But he kept his gaze locked on Leo, who was staring at him, his face a canvas of pure, uncomprehending shock. "I didn't buy it back with the money Leo was given," Ethan continued, his voice resonating with an unshakable authority. "That money is gone. It was built on a lie, and it vanished accordingly. I bought this place back with the money I earned in my garage. I bought it with every table, every chair, every bookshelf I built with my own 2 hands." He held up his hands, showing the calluses and faint scars. "I bought it back with the trust of every single client who believed in what this name is supposed to stand for. Quality, integrity, a promise kept. I didn't get it back through a lawsuit or a trick. I earned it back. This legacy," he said, gesturing to the workshop around them, "is not for sale." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, the full, crushing weight of the truth finally landed. Leo stared at his younger brother, at the man he had always dismissed as a quiet, sentimental fool. He had been outmaneuvered, outworked, and outlasted. He hadn't just lost the money, he had lost the entire game, a game he didn't even know his brother was playing. It was a defeat so total, so absolute, that it broke something deep inside him. He visibly sagged, the last bit of air deflating from his hollow frame. Helen, her face pale, finally looked from the broken son she had enabled to the strong, centered son she had doubted. The carefully constructed reality she had lived in for a year shattered, and tears of profound, painful clarity began to stream down her face. She had been blind. She had chosen the glitter over the gold, the performance over the substance. And now, the consequences of that choice were standing right in front of her. The confrontation was over. There was no shouting, no screaming. There was only the quiet, undeniable truth, illuminated by the bright morning light streaming through the clean windows of the restored workshop. Justice hadn't been an act of vengeance. It had been an act of restoration. And the legacy was finally home. In the stunned silence that followed Ethan's revelation, the guests began to drift away, murmuring amongst themselves, unsure of what to say. It was a moment too raw, too intensely personal for casual conversation. Soon, only the family remained, scattered amongst the gleaming machines like pieces of a broken puzzle. Helen was weeping quietly, being comforted by her sister, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to look at either of her sons. Leo stood alone in a far corner of the workshop, staring at the new sign, Miller's Legacy, as if trying to decipher a language he had never learned. Ethan was about to approach him when Leo, moving like a sleepwalker, came to him first. His face was a pale, empty mask. "He knew," Leo whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Dad knew this would happen." Ethan frowned, confused. "What are you talking about, Leo?" Before Leo could answer, Samuel Blackwood stepped forward, his expression somber. "He's right, Ethan," the old lawyer said, his voice commanding the attention of everyone left in the room. "Your father was a master craftsman, but he was also a student of human nature. He loved both his boys, but he was not blind to their character. He hoped for the best, but he planned for the worst." Samuel reached into his briefcase and pulled out a well-worn leather-bound folder. It was Arthur Miller's last will and testament. Your father's will was a beautiful piece of work, much like his furniture. Simple on the surface, but with a hidden, masterfully constructed joint holding it all together. He left the business to both of you, hoping you would balance each other out. But he also included a very specific, private codicil, a fail-safe. He opened the folder. He called it the Restoration Clause. It stipulated that if either brother sold their controlling interest in the company and subsequently filed for personal bankruptcy within a period of 5 years from the date of sale, the other brother would be granted the right to repurchase the entirety of the original business assets and the name Miller and Sons from the bankrupt brother's estate for the symbolic sum of $1. A wave of shock rippled through the small group. Samuel continued, looking at Leo with eyes full of sorrowful understanding. Your father foresaw this, Leo. He knew your ambition was a fire without a hearth, and he knew Ethan's patience was as deep as old-growth timber. He didn't want to punish you. He wanted to give you a lesson he could no longer teach. He bet that you would trade the priceless for the perishable, and he bet that Ethan would have the strength of character to endure and rebuild. Your hard work, Ethan, was what won the day. But your father built the chessboard. The finality of it was crushing. This wasn't just a story of Ethan's victory. It was the last, posthumous act of a father who understood his children perfectly, a final, heartbreaking lesson in value and worthlessness. All eyes turned to the two brothers. Leo looked as if the floor had dissolved beneath him. His own father had anticipated his failure with such devastating accuracy. He was not a tragic hero, he was a predictable outcome. Ethan walked over to his brother, the man who had tried to erase him. There was no anger left in him, only a vast, quiet sadness. He did not offer a hand in forgiveness, nor did he offer a final word of condemnation. He offered something else entirely. The workshop opens for business tomorrow morning at 6, Ethan said, his voice even. The floors need to be swept, the sawdust bins need to be emptied, the lumber deliveries need to be stacked. He looked his brother directly in the eye. It's hard work. It doesn't pay much, but it's an honest job. The position is yours if you want it. He was not offering partnership. He was not offering forgiveness. He was offering a broom. He was offering a chance for Leo to start again. Not at the top, not even in the middle, but at the absolute bottom, with the opportunity to earn back a piece of his own dignity, not with money, but with sweat and humility. The choice, and the sliver of a future it represented, was left entirely up to him. Never underestimate the quiet resilience of a person who has been pushed too far. Justice isn't always about loud revenge. Sometimes it's about the silent, steady work of rebuilding what was broken. Ethan Miller had reclaimed his legacy, not just by outsmarting a corporation or outlasting his brother's greed, but by staying true to the lessons his father had taught him in the language of wood and steel. He learned that the strongest foundations are built of integrity, and that a father's love can sometimes be a final, painful, and perfect lesson that echoes long after he is gone. Every family has its secrets, and every secret has its price. The story of the Miller family is now closed, but the truths it revealed remain. Join us next time for another story of the tangled ties that bind and sometimes break the American family.